come from. Frankincense on the open market is 35 cents a pound and myrrh 75. In a Los Angeles court today, Charles Manson, charged in the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others, told the judge he did not want a lawyer to plead his case, that he wanted to plead his own. The judge spent an hour trying to talk him out of it, but failed, and finally he agreed to let Manson, when he is tried, represent himself.
McMecken, West Virginia, is one of the many little mill and mining towns that cling to hills along the Ohio River. Most people here don't remember Charles Manson, but this was the closest thing he had to a hometown when he was growing up. He lived with an aunt and uncle in this house. Manson never knew his father. His mother was a prostitute who spent time in prison. School records in McMecken show Manson was an average student in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades. Then he went to live again with his mother, who was still a prostitute. In this neighborhood in Indianapolis, he had his first brush with the law for stealing a bicycle and then a car. He was 14. Manson's mother deserted him. At the urging of a Catholic priest, he was sent to Boys Town, where he lasted 3 days before stealing a car and burglarizing a supermarket. He was sent to the Indiana Boys School, the state reform school. He wouldn't conform to the rules and was moved from one dormitory to another. Manson compiled 28 bad conduct reports in 2 years. At one point, he was barred from Catholic church services. Then he complained he was being discriminated against. His IQ was rated then at 104, but he failed the 8th grade. That was the last of his formal schooling.
He was, as I described perhaps 20 years ago, a chronic discipline problem even at that time. He was a very average student, very poor quality work. He showed very little, if any, interest in school work.
How was he regarded by the other boys?
The other students seemed to regard him as a boy they liked to mingle with. Manson seemed to have a lot of stories to tell that was of interest to the other boys.
The file on Manson at the reform school shows he escaped 5 times. There are letters there from his aunt and grandmother in which they write of their love for him and their hopes that he would do better. There are also postcards written by Manson to schoolmates while he was free on his last escape. He urged them to stay in and then get out the right way.
When Manson was 16, his character and personality were evaluated by teachers here. The consensus was he was self-centered, generally lazy, cooperated only under pressure, and had little influence on other people for either good or bad.
Manson, at age 16, was placed in a federal reform school. He stayed there until he was 20. When he was released, he went back to McMecken, worked at a few odd jobs, and a few months later he was married here to a 17-year-old girl. They moved into a house across the street. Manson's wife had a baby, but before it was born, he was in trouble with the law again, arrested for driving a stolen car to California. That was in 1955. For the next 12 years, it was one prison after another, for auto theft, forgery, white slavery. In his last years in prison, Manson began studying offbeat religions. He read books on influencing people, and he took an interest in music. In March of 1967, he was released on parole and moved into San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, where nobody cared about his prison record, girls were his for the taking, and where an ex-con could pose as a musician and get lost in the hippie crowd. He lived here for a time, 636 Cole Street, where the group that was known later as Manson's family began to gather around him. His admirers were numerous. One of them, who did not want his face shown, talked about the hold that Manson had on his followers.
He'd been out of jail for approximately a year at that time and had a school bus, big black school bus. He had a couple of cars. He had, at least a dozen girls around him. He had a number of guys. Had influential friends, some of whose names have already come out, some of whom haven't. And he, just had a way with people that seemed to show, what he was saying was right. He was, a very charismatic individual. I guess some people have called it magnetic, and some people say that they were hypnotized. But he was just a very, very charismatic individual.
That was more than a year ago. The family had moved from Northern California to the Spawn Movie Ranch near Los Angeles, living off garbage, sleeping on floors, and playing the roles of